Let's say this is a walking red flag moment you ignored, but later regretted. Story 1. I met a guy online and everything seemed great at first. He was charming, funny, and we had a lot in common. We went on a few dates and things were progressing quickly. But there was a moment that I now realize should have been a red flag. We were talking about our past relationships and he casually mentioned that he still kept in touch with his ex. Not only that, but he made it clear that he had a close friendship with her, even though they were both in new relationships. He brushed it off as nothing, saying, "We're just friends, no big deal." At the time, I thought it wasn't a big deal either. After all, I had my own friends from past relationships, so I didn't see why it should matter. But as time went on, I noticed that whenever he and his ex talked, he'd get a little distant. He'd also sometimes cancel plans to hang out with her, claiming it was just a catch-up. Eventually, the ex started to become a larger part of our relationship than I was comfortable. I ignored it for far too long, thinking I was overreacting. In the end, he ended up choosing her over me. I wish I had listened to that little voice in my head earlier and trusted my instincts. Story 2. It's funny how one comment can totally change your perspective. I had been dating a guy for a few months, and things were going well until one night, we were hanging out with a group of friends and the conversation turned to family. Out of nowhere, he started making these offhanded comments about how he didn't like his family very much, particularly his parents. He was pretty vocal about the fact that he thought they were toxic and manipulative. He went on and on about how they never really supported him, and he had no intention of ever reconciling with them. I remember feeling uncomfortable because it seemed a little extreme. But I shrugged it off, telling myself that maybe he had valid reasons to feel that way. Fast forward a few months, and I started noticing similar patterns in how he treated me. Whenever I disagreed with him or didn't give him exactly what he wanted, he would pull away, ignore me, or accuse me of being manipulative. I realized too late that his relationship with his family wasn't the only toxic relationship in his life. The moment he started treating me the same way he talked about them, I knew I should have taken that red flag seriously. I regretted not listening to my gut. Story 3. When I first started dating Sarah, she was the epitome of cool girl, super laid back, always up for an adventure and not easily rattled. One night, we were talking about relationships, and she told me that she didn't really believe in labels like boyfriend or girlfriend. I thought it was refreshing. After all, who needs labels when everything is going so well, right? As time passed, I started noticing little things that didn't sit right. She would cancel plans last minute, but never seemed to make any effort to reschedule. If I texted her too much or tried to have a deep conversation, she'd make a joke about it, as if I was being too serious. She also made it clear that she didn't like it when I asked her about her feelings or the future of our relationship. I thought it was just her being independent, and I admired that at first. But after a few months, I realized I was the only one putting in the effort. I tried to have a conversation about where we stood, and she just laughed it off, saying, "Let's just see where things go." That's when I realized I had been ignoring all the signs that she wasn't interested in building a deeper connection. I regret not recognizing that the cool girl facade was masking a complete lack of emotional availability. Story 4. I had been seeing someone for a few weeks and we had a pretty good connection. But there was one thing that made me uncomfortable every time it came up. His anger. I noticed that he would get really irritated by small things, like waiting in line at a coffee shop or someone cutting him off in traffic. He'd snap at people over the smallest inconveniences, and even though he'd apologize afterward, the anger would come right back the next time something triggered him. One evening, we were watching a movie, and he got frustrated with the remote not working properly. He slammed it on the table in a burst of anger, and I froze. He apologized right away, but the look in his eyes stuck with me. It was a red flag, but I brushed it off, thinking it was just a one-time thing. Months later, things only escalated. He started getting angry with me over trivial issues, and I found myself walking on eggshells to avoid setting him off. By the time I ended things, I had ignored so many red flags that it was hard to leave. I regret not listening to my gut and walking away sooner. Story 5. I started dating a guy who seemed perfect at first. He was well-spoken, ambitious, and had everything going, but there was one thing that made me uneasy. His relationship with money. He constantly talked about how much he hated people who didn't grind enough, and how those who weren't always hustling were lazy. I thought he was just driven and passionate, so I didn't think too much about it. But as we got more serious, I started seeing the signs of his obsession with wealth. He'd get upset if I didn't want to splurge on expensive dinners or go on lavish trips. He would criticize me for being frugal and suggested that I needed to change my mindset if I wanted to be successful. He also had this habit of trying to impress people with flashy purchases or bragging about how much money he made. Eventually, I realized that our values were completely misaligned, and the relationship felt more about appearances and materialism than genuine connection. I ignored the red flags because I didn't want to come off as someone who was not ambitious. I wish I had trusted myself and walked away sooner before his obsession with money became a major source of conflict. Story 6. I had been talking to this guy for a few weeks, and things seemed to be going well. He was funny, smart, and we shared a lot of the same interests. The problem started when we went on a trip together. We decided to take a weekend getaway to a small town just to get away from everything for a bit. During the drive there, he kept pointing out how the town seemed boring and too small, but I didn't mind, because I had a relaxing weekend in mind. Once we arrived, the tension began. Every little thing was an issue for him. The hotel room was too basic, the food at the restaurant too bland, and even the people in town seemed too simple for his taste. He was constantly complaining about how everything seemed beneath him. It hit me in that moment that I was dealing with someone who wasn't just picky, but who had a clear superiority complex. I tried to brush it off, thinking maybe he was just in a bad mood, but as the weekend went on, it only got worse. When we finally got back, I started to really see the pattern. It wasn't just the trip. He had a tendency to talk down about anyone who didn't live up to his standards. He always seemed so judgmental of everything, from the way people dressed to how they spent their free time. I found myself getting frustrated and upset with him, but the worst part was that I didn't listen to the red flag when it first appeared. I regretted not ending things sooner. A person who feels superior to others isn't someone who will be happy with you for long. Story 7. I had been dating someone for a few months, and while things were good, there was this odd moment early on that I brushed aside. We were talking about past relationships one evening, and he mentioned that his ex-girlfriend had been crazy and too emotional. I thought it was just him venting, as it's common to talk about exes in the early stages of a relationship. However, what bothered me was how he said it with such disdain and almost a lack of any empathy. I thought it was odd, but at the time, I told myself maybe there were circumstances I didn't know about. As time went on, I started to notice a similar pattern in how he would talk about other people. Anyone who had upset him, from friends to coworkers, was always labeled as crazy or irrational. It made me feel uneasy because it seemed like he wasn't taking responsibility for any issues in his relationships, always shifting the blame onto others. One evening, when I disagreed with something he said, he snapped at me, calling me overly emotional and too sensitive, just like he did with his ex. It was at that moment that I realized I had ignored a huge red flag, his inability to own up to his actions and always blaming others. That was the moment I knew I needed to walk away, but I regretted not paying attention sooner. Story 8. I met a girl through a mutual friend, and at first she seemed like the perfect match. She was smart, kind, and easy to talk to. But there was one thing that caught my attention and made me uncomfortable. She often talked about how much she hated people who were fake or inauthentic, and how she couldn't stand people who didn't keep it real. At first, I agreed with her. Who likes fake people, right? But over time, I realized that she was the most judgmental person I had ever met. If someone was late to a meeting, she'd call them unreliable. If someone wore something she didn't like, she'd mock them. If anyone was the slightest bit different from her, she had something negative to say about. I started to notice that she wasn't keeping it real. She was just being cruel. When I would call her out on it, she would say, "I'm just being honest." And I realized that she had this distorted view that being honest meant you could say whatever you wanted without any consideration for the other person's feelings. The worst part was when she started saying similar things about me, making comments about my style, my hobbies, even the way I looked. It dawned on me that I had ignored a huge red flag. Someone who constantly judges others without self-awareness isn't someone who's going to build you up, but tear you down. I wish I had walked away sooner, instead of thinking I could change her. Story 9. I had been dating a guy for a few months, and everything seemed fine. He was a nice guy, thoughtful, and we had a lot in common. But one night, when we were talking about his work, he made a comment that didn't sit right with me. He casually mentioned that he had a tendency to bend the rules when it came to work. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe he was just talking about how he stretched the truth in a job and was joking about the office politics. But the more we talked, the more I realized that he was serious. He told me that he often found ways around the system to make things work for him. At first, I thought he was just being cheeky and exaggerating. But as I got to know him better, I realized that this behavior extended beyond work. He started showing signs of dishonesty in our relationship too. From small things like lying about where he was going to bigger issues, like skipping out on a friend's birthday party without telling him. It became clear that he had a pattern of bending the truth to suit his needs, even if it hurt others in the process. I should have known from that first comment that I wasn't dealing with someone trustworthy. I regret ignoring that gut feeling and sticking around for as long as I did. Story 10. A few years ago, I started seeing someone who was very charming at first. He was confident, successful, and always seemed to have a plan for the future. One of the things he would often bring up, though, was how he loved to be in control. At first, I didn't think much of it. He just seemed like someone who knew what he wanted in life. But as we spent more time together, it became clear that his love for control wasn't just about his career. It was about everything. He would always make decisions for us, whether it was about where we went for dinner or what movie we watched. If I disagreed, he'd either dismiss my opinion or convince me that his choice was better. When we went out with friends, he always had to be the one leading the conversation or making the plans. He even started questioning my own career choices and giving unsolicited advice about what I should do with my life. It wasn't until he started dictating what I wore that I realized how toxic this control was. When I started to push back, he would get defensive and tell me I was being too sensitive or overreacting. I ignored it for a while, thinking it was just a phase. But when it started to feel like he was trying to micromanage every aspect of my life, I knew I had to get out. I regret not standing up for myself sooner and letting him take over so much of my life. The worst part is that I had ignored the signs, thinking that his control was just confidence. It wasn't. It was manipulation. Story 11. I was dating a guy I met at a party and everything seemed to be going great. He was funny, easygoing, and we shared a lot of the same interests. We talked about everything from books to politics, and our chemistry was undeniable. However, there was this one incident that I brushed off at the time, thinking it wasn't a big deal. One night, we were talking about travel plans and mentioned wanting to visit different countries. He casually told me that he had never been outside the country because it's just not worth the effort, and that he'd rather stay in his hometown because he felt no need to leave when everything he wanted was right there. At first, I found this refreshing. He was so comfortable with himself, he didn't need to prove anything by traveling or living somewhere else. But as our relationship continued, I began to notice that his no-need-to-leave attitude extended far beyond travel. He didn't like trying new things, meeting new people, or even stepping out of his comfort zone. When we went out, he would avoid meeting my friends or make excuses to stay home, saying he was more comfortable alone. The red flag was staring me in the face, and I should have realized that someone unwilling to expand their horizons might not be someone who was willing to grow with me. A couple of months in, I realized that the relationship was stagnant and wasn't going anywhere, and I regretted not noticing how much his mindset limited our connection. Story 12. I met a girl online, and at first I thought she was everything I was looking for. We hit it off immediately, with long, deep conversations that went on for hours. She had an adventurous spirit, loved nature, and seemed to be very open-minded. But there was something she said early on that I completely ignored. We were talking about future plans, and she mentioned how she couldn't understand why people would want to get married or have children. It just seems like a waste of time, she said. People should just enjoy life as it comes, without all the pressure. I didn't think much of it, and we continued talking for weeks without me thinking it was a big deal. But as time went on, I realized that she didn't just think marriage and kids were a waste of time. She thought commitment in general was. Whenever we talked about serious topics like building a life together or even sharing responsibilities, she would change the subject or laugh it off as boring or restrictive. Slowly, I began to see that her lack of commitment wasn't just about marriage. It was about everything. She didn't want to commit to anything, plans, long-term goals, or even our relationship. In the end, she told me that she wasn't looking for anything serious and wanted to keep things casual forever. I regretted not recognizing this earlier and walking away when I first saw how unwilling she was to truly invest in any part of her life or relationships. Story 13. I was in a relationship for a little while with a woman who was incredibly generous with her time and energy. She seemed to always want to help people, which I found admirable. But over time, I started to notice something that should have been a warning sign. She never seemed to take care of herself. At first, I thought it was just her giving nature. She'd spend hours volunteering, organizing events, or taking care of other people's problems, but always put her own needs last. She was constantly running on empty and often seemed burnt out. But when I suggested that she take a break or do something for herself, she would get defensive and say, "Helping others is what keeps me going. If I focus on myself, I'm being selfish." The more I saw her neglect her own well-being, the more I realized she had a martyr complex. She was so busy helping others that she would forget her own needs and, frankly, never even ask for help when she needed it. I felt like I was walking on eggshells, trying not to add to her stress, but it became apparent that she had no boundaries. She didn't allow herself to set any because she was too focused on pleasing everyone around her. It wasn't until we had a huge argument one night about how little she was taking care of herself that I saw how unhealthy the situation was. She snapped at me, accusing me of being unsupportive just for suggesting she take some time for herself. That was when I realized that her constant martyrdom was her way of avoiding facing her own issues. I regretted not paying attention to this red flag earlier. I had been in a relationship with someone who didn't know how to prioritize herself, and it was impossible for her to give me what I needed because she had nothing left to give. Story 14. I had been dating this amazing guy who seemed perfect, kind, funny, and charming. One of the things I loved most about him was how open he was about his emotions. He would share his thoughts on relationships, childhood, and his future without hesitation. But there was one thing I kept ignoring. Every time he spoke about his family, it was in a completely negative light. He talked about how much he disliked his parents, how they didn't understand him, and how he would never let them control his life. I didn't think much of it at first. I assumed that maybe he had unresolved issues with them. As we got closer, though, the red flag became clear. He would often compare me to his family, accusing me of being controlling if I expressed any concerns or boundaries. He said I was acting like his mother when I pointed out something he was doing that made me uncomfortable. This pattern repeated itself, and I started to realize that his anger and resentment towards his family were being directed towards me. If I ever disagreed with him or wanted to do something different than he planned, he would accuse me of being manipulative, or just like the people who tried to tell him what to do. At that point, I should have known it wasn't just about his family. His issues with them were a reflection of his inability to accept responsibility for his own actions, and he projected this blame onto anyone close to him. I ended the relationship, but I regretted not recognizing the toxic pattern sooner. Story 15. A few months into a new relationship, I started to realize something strange about my partner. She seemed sweet and caring, but there was this odd habit she had that started to raise concerns. Whenever we hung out with her friends, she would become visibly uncomfortable if someone was doing better than her in any way. She would always downplay any accomplishments or successes that others mentioned, either making excuses or belittling their achievements. One evening, we were at a party with her college friends, and a guy she had known for years was talking about his recent promotion. He was genuinely excited, and everyone was congratulating him. My girlfriend, on the other hand, kept making little comments like, "Oh, that's cool, but I don't know how he can stand working so many hours, and I wouldn't want a job like that." It sounds stressful. At first, I thought it was just her being awkward, but then I noticed the same pattern whenever anyone achieved something or got praised. She would immediately try to deflect the attention away from it. It became clear that her insecurity was much deeper than I had realized. She couldn't stand seeing people succeed or be happy because it reminded her of her own self-doubt. It didn't take long before I noticed that this behavior wasn't just about other people. It was about me too. Whenever I talked about something I was proud of, she would try to downplay it or bring up something negative about the situation. I finally confronted her about it, and while she apologized, I realized that the root of the issue was far too deep for me to fix. I regretted not seeing the red flag earlier and sticking with someone who wasn't comfortable in their own skin. Story 16. I had been in a relationship with this guy for a while, and things had been going well. We were both in our late 20s and had a similar sense of humor, shared hobbies, and a lot of common ground. However, there was one aspect of his life I couldn't ignore: his obsession with control. At first, I thought he was just a little particular about things. He liked to plan every detail, from what we ate to when we would go out and how long we would stay. It seemed efficient at first. Who doesn't love someone who knows exactly what they want? But as time went on, I began to realize that it wasn't just about planning. He controlled every part of our relationship. If I made plans with friends without consulting him first, he would get upset. If I didn't respond to a text within 10 minutes, he'd send follow-up messages asking why I wasn't paying attention. There were even times when he would subtly criticize my appearance, saying I'd look better if I dressed a certain way or changed my hairstyle to match his preference. At first, I brushed it off, convincing myself that he just wanted what was best for me. However, the turning point came when he started making decisions for me, even about important matters like my job. He would suggest I quit my job because it wasn't challenging enough for me, even though I loved my work. The more I tried to express myself or disagree with his suggestions, the more he would manipulate the situation, telling me I was being difficult or too emotional. I ignored the red flag for so long, thinking that he was just over-caring. It wasn't until I found myself feeling isolated from my friends and family and completely disconnected from the person I used to be that I realized I had been in a controlling relationship. I regretted not noticing the signs sooner. Story 17. I had been dating a guy for a couple of months when I started to notice something that should have been a huge red flag. At first, he seemed to be a perfect match. He was funny, charming, and seemed genuinely interested in me. But then he started making these offhand comments about his ex-girlfriends. He would talk about how crazy they were or how they always overreacted to things. He told me, I don't know why they just couldn't handle me. At first, I thought it was just him venting about bad relationships. I mean, we've all had bad experiences with exes, right? However, as our relationship progressed, I started noticing a pattern in his behavior. Every time I had a minor disagreement or voiced my feelings, he would accuse me of overreacting or being too sensitive. He would say things like, you're just like my ex, always making a big deal out of nothing. It started to sink in that this wasn't just a harmless habit. He was gaslighting. Every time I stood up for myself, he would twist my words, making me feel like I was the one being unreasonable. The worst part came when we had a big argument about something that actually mattered to me, and instead of taking any responsibility, he turned it around on me, claiming that I was too dramatic and making a bigger deal out of things than I needed to. I was exhausted and emotionally drained, but I kept ignoring the red flags, convincing myself that maybe he was just having a rough time or wasn't used to healthy communication. Eventually, I realized I couldn't continue in a relationship where my feelings were constantly invalidated. I wish I had seen that warning sign earlier and trusted myself. Story 18. I met a guy online and he seemed too good to be true. We had long, deep conversations about our dreams and values, and it felt like we understood each other better than anyone else. However, there was something about him that didn't sit right with me. One evening, after we had been hanging out for a few weeks, he casually mentioned that he didn't like people who were too ambitious, and that he thought people who worked too hard and had career goals were missing out on the fun side of life. At the time, I brushed it off as just a difference in perspective. But as time went on, I began to see how that mindset affected our relationship. He didn't understand why I was so focused on my career goals and ambitions, and he constantly tried to get me to skip work to hang out with him. If I spent too much time focusing on my professional goals, he would get frustrated, saying that I didn't care about spending time with him. He would even mock me for my success, claiming that I was too career-driven and didn't know how to relax. At first, I told myself he was just joking and that he would eventually come around. But the more he pushed for me to give up my goals, the more I realized that he was actually insecure about his own lack of ambition. He wanted me to depend on him for entertainment and happiness instead of pursuing my dreams. The red flag was right there in front of me the whole time, but I ignored it, thinking I could change his perspective. Eventually, I realized I couldn't keep compromising my values for someone who wasn't willing to support my growth. I regretted not listening to that warning sooner. Story 19. I had been seeing a girl for a few months and things were going well, but there was one moment that I should have seen coming. We had been spending a lot of time together, and she had invited me to her birthday party, which I thought was a great sign that things were getting serious. However, at the party, she made a comment that stuck with me. She said, "I can't believe how many people are actually showing up. It's so weird that anyone would actually take the time to celebrate. It's just a party. Who cares?" I thought it was a weird comment, but I didn't want to make a big deal out of it. However, as the night went on, I started to notice how uncomfortable she was when anyone paid attention to her. Whenever someone gave her a compliment or mentioned how great she looked, she would brush it off and change the subject. It was like she couldn't accept being the center of attention in a positive way. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that she had an underlying fear of vulnerability. She couldn't handle praise or affection because it made her feel exposed or weak. I should have seen that red flag and understood that someone who couldn't accept love or recognition was unlikely to be able to give love back in a healthy way. I stuck with the relationship for a while, hoping she'd open up, but it became clear that she wasn't ready to truly connect. I regret not recognizing the deeper issue sooner and moving on before getting too invested. Story 20. I had been dating someone for a while, and there was a moment early on that I wish I had paid more attention to. We were hanging out with friends, and they were all talking about their plans for the weekend. One of them mentioned an event they were planning, and my boyfriend immediately shut it down, saying, "That sounds dumb. You guys are wasting your time on stupid stuff like that." Everyone kind of went quiet, and the conversation moved on. But I noticed that he had a way of belittling other people's ideas whenever they didn't match his own. At first, I thought it was just him being opinionated or not interested in the same things. But as time went on, I began to realize that this wasn't just a harmless quirk. He would constantly criticize my friends, my family, and even the things I loved doing in my spare time. He didn't understand why I loved certain hobbies, and he would often make passive-aggressive remarks about them. It became clear that he had no respect for anyone else's choices or interests, as if his way of thinking was the only right way. The more he tried to mold my world into what he thought it should be, the more I began to feel stifled. I ignored the warning signs for too long, hoping that he would learn to appreciate diversity in people's opinions and lifestyles. In the end, I realized I was with someone who had a narrow view of the world and wasn't open to accepting anyone else's differences. I wish I had listened to that first red flag when it appeared. Story 21. I started seeing a guy who seemed like the perfect match at first. He was smart, funny, and incredibly passionate about his work. He often spoke about how he was working hard to build a future for himself, and I admired his ambition. But there was one detail that I should have noticed earlier. He never seemed to have any time for anyone else. He would constantly cancel plans with friends and family, always claiming he was too busy with work. It wasn't until I spent more time with him that I began to see how much he genuinely isolated himself. I tried to be understanding, thinking that he was just really dedicated to his career and that it was something that would eventually pay off. But over time, I began to notice a pattern in his behavior. He didn't just prioritize work over others, he actively pushed people away. If I made a comment about how we hadn't spent much time together, he would tell me, "I'm just focused on my goals right now. I'll have time for you later." Even when he did have a rare free moment, he would use it to check work emails or prepare for upcoming meetings instead of spending it with me. The turning point came when he missed my birthday. He claimed he had to work on a project and couldn't make it, despite saying we would celebrate earlier in the week. That's when it hit me. This wasn't just about his dedication to his job. It was about a lack of balance in his life. I regretted not noticing how his obsession with work was slowly becoming an excuse to avoid building meaningful connections with people, including me. I realized that someone who constantly prioritizes work over relationships will never make space for the people who truly matter in their life. Story 22. I met a girl at a coffee shop one afternoon, and we hit it off instantly. We talked about everything: books, movies, our favorite places to visit, and how we both valued honesty in relationships. Everything felt easy and natural, and I couldn't help but feel like I had finally met someone who truly understood. But there was something about her past that she didn't share right away. We had been seeing each other for a few weeks when she started opening up about her history with exes. One night, she casually mentioned that she had a history of toxic relationships, where her exes had been emotionally manipulative and she'd been cheated on. She said that she didn't trust anyone anymore because of it. At first, I was understanding. She had been hurt before, and I empathized with that. But as our relationship grew, I began to notice the way she would test. She would accuse me of things I never did, like suggesting I was lying when I wasn't. She would get upset when I hung out with friends or didn't immediately respond to her texts. Every time we had an argument, she would bring up how all men were the same and how she could never trust anyone, no matter what they did. It didn't take long for me to realize that her inability to trust wasn't something I could fix. She was so stuck in her past trauma that she couldn't open herself up to a healthy relationship. I tried to reassure her and prove my loyalty, but it was never enough. I was constantly walking on eggshells, afraid of triggering her insecurities. Eventually, I ended things because I knew I couldn't keep carrying the burden of her unresolved issues. I regretted not recognizing earlier that her emotional baggage was preventing her from having a real connection with anyone. Story 23. I had been in a relationship with someone for nearly a year when things started to feel off. At first, it was little things. Small lies about where he was or who he was with. Nothing major. But the more I spent time with him, the more I realized that he couldn't seem to tell the truth, even about trivial matters. When I asked him about his past relationships, he would say things like, "Oh, I've been in a few serious relationships, but they never worked out because people are just too crazy." He would also make comments about how he was always the good guy and how people had wronged him. It took a while for me to catch on, but eventually, I realized that he never took responsibility for anything. He always painted himself as the victim, blaming everyone else for his problems. When we had disagreements, he would always twist the conversation and make me feel guilty for even bringing it up. He constantly played the victim card, using his past to justify his behavior. It wasn't just a red flag, it was a full-on warning sign. One day, I finally confronted him about how he had been lying to me for months. Instead of admitting the truth, he deflected and told me that I was the one who was too paranoid and that I had trust issues. I realized that he was never going to take accountability for his actions, and that I was in a relationship with someone who would manipulate the truth to avoid facing their own mistakes. It was heartbreaking, but I ended things. Looking back, I wish I had trusted my instincts and walked away sooner. Story 24. I had been dating a guy for a few months, and everything seemed great. He was fun, spontaneous, and had a sense of adventure that I admired. We'd go on weekend trips, try new activities, and share tons of laughs. But then, one day, we were talking about long-term goals, and he made a comment that made me pause. He said, "I'm just not really into settling down. I think people who are too focused on the future are missing out on living in the moment." At the time, I shrugged it off, thinking he was just joking, or maybe he was trying to sound more carefree than he actually was. However, as our relationship progressed, it became apparent that he wasn't joking. He avoided any conversations about commitment, future plans, or what our relationship was supposed to be. Every time I brought up my thoughts on the future, he would change the subject or give vague answers like, "I'm just enjoying life, man." He was constantly avoiding any form of responsibility, whether it was deciding on where we should go or making plans for the next month. It dawned on me that he wasn't the carefree, spontaneous guy I thought he was. He was just avoiding any sort of accountability. The relationship ended when I realized that he had no desire to work towards anything meaningful, and that I was essentially treading water while he floated by. It wasn't the spontaneous adventures I needed. It was someone who was willing to share goals and build something real. I regretted not listening to that warning earlier, as it would have saved me months of frustration. Story 25. I had been in a relationship with someone who was absolutely charming at first. He was thoughtful, attentive, and made me feel incredibly special. He would surprise me with flowers, write me cute little notes, and plan these elaborate dates. It felt like a fairy tale. But as time went on, I began to realize that he wasn't just thoughtful, he was possessive. He would get upset if I spent too much time with my friends or family, claiming that I should be prioritizing him over everything else. He would even check my phone when I wasn't looking, accusing me of talking to other people, even though I was completely loyal. At first, I thought it was sweet that he cared so much, but then it quickly escalated. He started showing up at places uninvited, showing up at my work just to check in, and making sure I never went anywhere without him. If I went to the store or out for a walk, he would get upset and demand to know where I had been and with whom. I began to feel suffocated. The more I tried to assert my independence, the more controlling he became. And it wasn't just about love anymore, it was about power. It wasn't until I had a breakdown, feeling completely overwhelmed, that I realized how toxic the relationship had become. I ended things, but the emotional scars lingered. I regretted not seeing the red flags earlier, and I should have realized that a person who tries to control your life and your relationships isn't someone who genuinely loves you. Story 26. I met this guy through a mutual friend, and from the moment we started talking, I felt a connection. He was charming, had an incredible sense of humor, and seemed to be very open about his life. After a few dates, we got into a deeper conversation about values in the future, and he casually mentioned that he had been in a lot of toxic relationships in the past. He said he was done with commitment because every time he tried to be serious, things always went south. At the time, I thought he was just jaded from bad experiences and that I could show him that not all relationships were like that. Over the next few weeks, however, I began to see a pattern in his behavior. He would always talk about how he couldn't trust people or how he'd never let anyone in too close. At first, I tried to ignore it, telling myself that I could change his view on relationships. But things started escalating. He would get distant whenever I tried to talk about the future or any kind of long-term plans. He didn't like having serious conversations, and if I pushed too hard, he would get defensive and tell me I was too intense. Slowly, I realized that he wasn't just avoiding commitment, he was actively sabotaging any chance we had of building something lasting. Eventually, I had to end things. I realized that no matter how much I wanted to make it work, he wasn't ready for what I was looking for. I regretted not listening to the signs earlier. His reluctance to trust wasn't something I could fix. It was part of who he was, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't change that. Story 27. I had been dating a guy for a couple of months, and everything seemed fine at first. He was sweet, attentive, and always made me feel like I was the most important person in the room. He was very supportive of my career, always asking about my work and offering encouragement. However, there was one thing that I began to notice that made me uncomfortable. He was always comparing me to his ex-girlfriends. It started with small remarks like, "Well, my ex used to do this," or "She always made sure I had everything I needed." At first, I thought it was just a passing comment, but it became more frequent. Every time we did something together, he would mention how his exes were more considerate, or how they understood him better. It wasn't just casual, though. It was like he was subtly trying to make me feel like I wasn't living up to his past relationships. The tipping point came when we had a conversation about a potential future together, and he mentioned that his ex had been so much better at keeping things exciting. He even suggested that I could learn from how they had approached their relationship. It was in that moment that I realized how much I had been internalizing his comparisons. I wasn't being valued for who I was, but for how I measured up to his past. I realized that I deserved to be with someone who appreciated me for my own unique qualities, not as some replacement or comparison to someone else. I ended things soon after that conversation, and while it was tough, I'm grateful I recognized the red flags. I regret not realizing sooner that someone who continuously brings up their past relationships isn't ready to fully commit to the present. Story 28. I had been seeing a guy for about 6 months, and things had been pretty smooth until we started talking about our childhoods. I had mentioned something about my relationship with my parents and how they were very supportive of my choices, even if they didn't always agree with me. His response was a bit strange. He said that he had a very distant relationship with his parents, and didn't really care to keep in touch with them because they were toxic. I thought that was a little extreme, but I didn't want to judge him. Everyone's family dynamic is different, right? However, As we continued to talk more about his family, it became apparent that his distant relationship wasn't just a matter of personal preference, it was part of a pattern. He started calling them names like emotionally unstable and selfish. And when he spoke about his siblings, it was always with disdain. He would frequently tell me that people who cared about family were weak and that I shouldn't waste my time with people who bring you down. I didn't realize it at the time, but this was a huge red flag. His inability to maintain any healthy relationships, including with his family, was a warning that he might have issues with emotional intimacy. As time went on, I started to see the same pattern in our relationship. Whenever we had a disagreement, he would shut down, refusing to talk things through. He would get cold and distant, telling me that he didn't care enough to argue. I realized that his deep-seated issues with his family were affecting how he connected with others, including me. Eventually, I had to let go. I regret not recognizing earlier that his inability to have healthy relationships was a sign that he wasn't ready for a mature, emotionally fulfilling partnership. Story 29. I met someone new at a mutual friend's party and the chemistry was instant. We spent the night talking, laughing, and exchanging stories. He was charming, confident, and seemed like he had his life together. A few weeks later, we went on a weekend trip, and that's when I started noticing something that should have been a huge red flag. We were exploring the city when he suddenly made a comment about how people are too obsessed with the idea of true love. He said, "You're lucky if you find someone who isn't a complete waste of time. I think most relationships are just convenient distractions." I was taken aback, but I didn't want to overreact. Maybe he was just being cynical, I thought. But over the next few weeks, he began to show signs that backed up his words. Whenever I tried to have a serious conversation about our future or what we both wanted out of the relationship, he would avoid it or tell me I was overthinking things. He would act distant and uninvested in the relationship, often telling me that I was putting too much pressure on something that should just be fun. It wasn't long before I realized that he wasn't interested in anything deeper. He enjoyed spending time with me, but he had no intention of building something meaningful. I eventually ended things with him, but I regretted not listening to that comment from the beginning. I ignored the red flag because I didn't want to seem too demanding, but I ended up with someone who wasn't capable of valuing the kind of relationship I wanted. Story 30. I was dating a guy for a few months and everything seemed perfect. He was thoughtful, kind, and treated me with so much respect. But as time went on, I started to notice something unsettling. He would make constant references to how much money he made and how much better his lifestyle was compared to others. It wasn't subtle. He would bring up his job and salary in nearly every conversation, comparing himself to friends, family, and even strangers. It wasn't just about his achievements either. It was about putting others down. One day, we were having a conversation about travel, and he mentioned how only poor people go on budget vacations, and how anyone who couldn't afford a five-star hotel was just settling for less. It rubbed me the wrong way, but I brushed it off. He was just trying to impress me, right? But it kept happening. Every time we went out to eat, he would point out how much better the restaurant was than the one down the street, or how much more expensive a bottle of wine was compared to what other people drank. The final straw came when I told him about a charity event I was attending. He looked at me and said, "You should be careful. People who do charity work are just trying to make themselves feel better. It's all for show." That was when I realized that the person I was dating had a deep disdain for people who didn't live in the same financial bubble he did. I ended things soon after, but I regretted not addressing the issue sooner. His obsession with wealth and superiority was a major red flag, and I should have realized that it wasn't something I wanted to tolerate in a partner. Story 31. I met Ben at a work event and we immediately clicked. He was the kind of guy who could easily make you laugh, someone who didn't take life too seriously, but was also deeply passionate about his career. After a few weeks of casual texting, we started dating, and everything felt perfect at first. We spent weekends hiking, trying out new restaurants, and watching movies together. He seemed like the kind of guy who was genuinely interested in getting to know me, but then something started to feel off. We had only been dating a few months when I started noticing how often he would mention how everything always goes wrong for him. It wasn't just the occasional bad day. He seemed to constantly have a sob story no matter what. "My boss doesn't appreciate me," he would say. Or, "I tried to do something good for my friend and they took advantage of me." It wasn't just small complaints either. He had a way of making me feel like everything that went wrong in his life was someone else's fault. I started to feel the weight of it all. Whenever something small went wrong in my day, he would act like I was overreacting or being too negative, but then turn around and make everything about himself. Slowly, I realized that he didn't take responsibility for anything in his life. It was exhausting to be around someone who was so consumed with his own struggles but never seemed to look inward. One day, I finally confronted him about it. He told me that I was being unsupportive, that I was always too focused on positivity, and that I didn't understand what he was going through. It hit me then. He was stuck in a victim mentality, and he didn't want anyone, including me, to challenge that. I ended things shortly after, but I regretted ignoring the signs for as long as I did. Story 32. I was in a relationship with someone for a year who was, in many ways, everything I thought I wanted. He was considerate, caring, and always seemed to want the best for me. We had long, deep conversations about life, our values, and our goals. However, there was this one habit he had that I initially brushed off as a harmless quirk. He would often interrupt me when I was speaking, even during important conversations. At first, I thought he was just excited or that he was really invested in what I was saying. But over time, the interruptions started to feel dismissive. It wasn't just during trivial conversations either. It happened when I was expressing my feelings or talking about something important to me. He would cut me off with a quick, "That's not what I meant," or "You're overthinking it," or even start talking about his own experience without letting me finish. The worst part was when I tried to address it. I brought it up a couple of times, explaining how I felt unheard, but he brushed it off as me being too sensitive. He said that if I was really paying attention, I would see that he was just trying to help by jumping in. I started second-guessing myself. Maybe I was being too sensitive. Maybe I was just being dramatic. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized how this was affecting our relationship. He wasn't just interrupting me in conversations. He was subtly invalidating my thoughts and emotions. It was as though my voice didn't matter, and that I was supposed to fit into his narrative of what was right. Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. I broke up with him. But it was a tough decision because I had ignored this red flag for far too long. I regretted not confronting the issue sooner and settling for a relationship where I felt like I had to fight for my voice.